I welcome you all for this interesting webinar, part of Environmental Energy and Natural Resource Center at the University of Houston Law Center. So we are happy to welcome our uh, distinguished speaker, Professor Hannah Wiseman. She's a leading voice in energy and environmental law, and her scholarship has profoundly influenced the field of land use regulation, oil and gas, administrative law, and environmental law. So she is currently serving as a professor of law at Penn State Law, and she's also Wilson Faculty Fellow at the College of Earth and Mineral Science. And she's a co-founder, co-faculty member, co-founded faculty member with the Institute of Energy uh, and Environment. So she is well known, and she published in many law review journals, including Stanford Law Review, New York Law Review, and others. So for her topic today is very interesting, and she talked about grid reliability in the electric era and the role of North American Electric Reliability Cooperation, and what kind of reforms that she suggests to better cope and meet our environmental law and moving like accelerating renewable energy in our country. So for the one who are looking for the CLE credit, I am going to show you the credit after her talk. And meanwhile, if you have any question, you can post the question in a Q&A box. And we have like, at the end, we have like 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. So Professor Wiseman, thank you so much for your time, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karaman, for hosting, and thanks to everyone for being here. I'm speaking today about the reliability of the electric grid, which I know is an issue that's especially important in Texas, given the events of 2021. It sounds like you all weathered the recent cold snap better than in 2021, but many parts of the country will continue to experience a variety of reliability close calls due to extreme weather and other events. Now, please let me know, Carmen, can you please send me a chat if you're not seeing the correct slides? So I should have just moved to the agenda. Are we good? Do we have
Yes,
agenda?
we see
Thank you.
your slides.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'll speak today about the overall challenge of electric reliability, again, which I know many of you are already familiar with. We'll talk about who is responsible for maintaining the reliability of the electric grid. I'll suggest the drivers of the current challenges we're facing with respect to the reliability of the grid, and then focus specifically on governance challenges. So not just the substantive challenges, such as we're experiencing more extreme weather and therefore more difficulty ensuring there's adequate generation to cover demand, but also the rules and the procedures that ensure reliability. What are the challenges associated with those, and what might be some solutions in that area? So first of all, the substantive challenge of electric reliability. The reliability of the electric grid refers to providing as much electricity as everyone needs all of the time. So reliability means the lights stay on, the electricity stays on all the time, no matter how much electricity is being demanded, no matter what the weather is. Now, of course, we don't always meet that aspiration of reliability. And the electric grid refers to generation, so the units that are producing electricity, transmission, which are the long distance wires carrying the electricity from generators to more local areas, and then distribution, which is the smaller lines that you see sometimes above ground within neighborhoods on often wooden poles or that are buried. And those distribution wires are sending electricity directly to homes, industry, and businesses. And the challenge of this entire system is that electricity is very different from most goods because it's not easy to store. It's not easy to just put it all in a battery or pump it uphill, uh, and then release the water when we need the electricity. Now, those are technologies that are expanding, the storage technologies, but right now, storage is still relatively expensive. And so for the most part, the way to ensure reliable grid is every second of the day to exactly match the amount of electricity being demanded with the amount of electricity being generated. And by matching the load, the amount of electricity being demanded or used, and generation, a nice smooth frequency is maintained in the transmission wires. And that frequency is just the path that the electricity follows, the number of waves per second, essentially. And in the United States, that frequency is referred to as 60 hertz. If we move too far away from that 60 hertz frequency, bad things happen. For traditional generators, such as natural gas-fired turbines, those generators are literally rotating. And if the frequency gets off too much, they can potentially rotate out of control. Now, there are protective systems that cause those generators to trip if the frequency deviates too much from that 60 hertz. Now, solar energy, in which Texas is a leader, solar energy is a little different. You don't have, for a solar photovoltaic panel that is generating electricity, you don't have anything rotating. So there is an inverter connected to the solar panel that produces that alternating current, that sort of sine wave current through the wires. And the inverter will also trip if the frequency in the transmission lines deviates too much from 60 hertz. So the challenge is, how do we constantly match the amount of electricity being generated with the amount of electricity being demanded? And this is especially challenging in what I, along with my co-authors on a recent paper called the electric era. So what I'm talking about today is a topic that I've written about with co-authors Josh Macy at Yale Law School and Shelley Welton at University of Pennsylvania Law School. And we and others have defined the current time as an electric era because more of our daily lives are being electrified. There are more electric vehicles. More people are converting to their heating to heat pumps, for example. This is partly due to some state incentives and recent federal incentives. So we have more electrification of cars, houses, businesses happening, thus creating more load. At the same time, we have more individual users of large load, such as data centers producing artificial intelligence products, crypto mining for currency, electrolysis, which are facilities that produce hydrogen from water using electricity. These types of large loads are very big users that are trying to interconnect to the electric grid. And just as more users are demanding electricity, it is harder to get that electricity into the grid because there are a variety of constraints on generation. So I want to tell you just a recent issue in Pennsylvania you may have heard of. There are many data centers such as Amazon and Google trying to very quickly find sources of generation. And so what they're proposing to do is to build data centers right near the generation, such as nuclear power plants, and to take that generation, and rather than having that generation go into the broader electric grid, the data centers are proposing to just use that generation for themselves. Amazon is already co-located with the Susquehanna nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania. Amazon recently proposed, however, to get even more electricity from that nuclear power plant, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission rejected that interconnection request, saying this may be detrimental to the broader electric grid. Pulling all of this electricity off the grid and sending it directly to a data center could be a problem. We need to research this more. So we have more load, and at the same time, we have less reliability. We're having more trouble getting the generation built and operating to serve the load. This is in part due to extreme weather, which you have seen in recent weeks from Texas all the way up to where I live in Pennsylvania. The growth of intermittent generation, such as wind and solar energy, generation that you cannot guarantee will run all of the time unless it is co-located with storage, such as a battery. So these are very important generation resources, in part because they avoid some of the fuel constraints that you saw in 2021 with Winter Storm Uri. A wind farm doesn't need a pipeline carrying wind to it. However, the wind farm does not operate all the time because the wind is not always blowing. So there are benefits and challenges associated with the growth of generations such as solar and wind, which is currently the fastest growing generation resource, solar in particular. The transmission system, I'll focus a lot on inadequate wires to carry electricity today. That's one of the main challenges that's making the US electric grid less reliable. Resource adequacy, we simply do not have enough power plants. But I put power plants as a subset of transmission because in my view, the lack of an adequately expansive transmission network is one of the primary contributors to the inadequate generation, which is also called resource adequacy. Another issue I'll talk about is flexibility. We don't just need physical power plants that can run all the time. That is one important issue. But we also need resources on the grid that can very quickly change their status. They can very quickly ramp up the amount of electricity they're infusing into the grid, or they can reduce the electricity. That's called flexibility. We need that flexibility for a variety of reasons, in part because of the intermittent generation resources that are growing on the grid. If the sun suddenly goes behind a cloud and we have a decrease in solar generation, we need something to quickly ramp up to replace that decreased generation. That's what's called flexibility, the quick response that's needed, as opposed to making sure there's a really big natural gas fired power plant sitting there if the weather gets really cold. Another reliability challenge cited by the nation's entity that's responsible for reliability, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, is cyber security. In this case, we have cyber insecurity because several nations have proven that they are able to hack into the US grid. They have warned us by occasionally sending messages to the computer systems of grid operators. So we know they can hack in. Many components of the grid, generation, transmission, and distribution, have digital devices connected to the grid. And I've heard owners and operators of power plants say what keeps them awake at night is the fear that someone will come into that power plant and do something to one of those digital devices that will cause a problem. So cyber insecurity is a big challenge, but it's not the focus of my presentation today. So who is responsible from the government level for ensuring that the lights stay on? I noted that the primary entity is North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. NERC is a private organization, and it was a wholly private organization until 2006. It was comprised primarily of private entities, the owners and operators of power plants and transmission lines. In 2005, Congress passed the Energy Policy Act, which said that there needed to be more governmental oversight of this private organization called NERC. So effective 2006, NERC remained a private corporation, but it is now overseen by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. There are other entities that are centrally responsible for making sure the lights stay on. So the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, it does not only oversee NERC, it also oversees the interstate transmission grid, with the exception of Texas, Alaska, and Hawaii, because those grids are sort of islanded. So FERC oversees the reliability of all the transmission lines moving electricity around the United States. Then there are these entities called regional transmission organizations, which in Texas, yours is ERCOT. But these exist, they cover about 2/3 of the United States with respect to population, and they control the flow of electricity through transmission lines. And they also control how much new generation needs to be built to ensure there's enough electricity in those transmission lines. These are also alternately called independent system operators because different names have been used for them over the years, but I'm just going to refer to them as regional transmission organizations. States are also centrally responsible for keeping the lights on because states also make decisions about how much generation will be built. And you know this due to the recent Proposition 7 in Texas, which created this fund that will build to something around $9 or $10 billion of new generation infrastructure. So states decide, well, maybe there's not enough generation to cover all the need. Maybe the regional transmission organization in charge has not ensured enough capacity, so they are also involved in that decision. I want to emphasize here, I have Texas included here because some people are under the impression that Texas is not subject to the jurisdiction of NERC, and that is incorrect. Texas does fall under the jurisdiction of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC. So NERC issues things called reliability standards, which are requirements for ensuring that generators are, for example, adequately weatherized. Texas is subject to those standards. Even though Texas is not directly subject to Federal Energy Regulatory Commission jurisdiction, it is subject to NERC jurisdiction with respect to reliability. Then there are these other regulators who are also very important for keeping the lights on. The operators of those who govern natural gas wells, like the Texas Railroad Commission and pipelines, because as you know, in 2021, as some of you likely know, some of the natural gas wells had equipment that froze up. So the amount of natural gas available in Texas went way down. The wells were not adequately weatherized. And some of the pipelines that were supposed to carry natural gas to the power plants stopped operating. So there were other regulators also responsible for reliability challenges. Any of you who want to see proof that Texas is in fact subject to NERC jurisdiction, here is, I've just included here the delegation agreement between NERC and the Texas Reliability Entity. Okay, so what does NERC do? We'll talk about this more later. NERC is, again, primarily responsible for keeping the lights on. A lot of NERC's work is looking at the situation throughout the United States and determining what might be problematic with respect to reliability. What are the risks? And they make assessments for the summer and the winter and for the entire year ahead. And when states and FERC and regional transmission organizations make decisions such as how much new capacity needs to be built, they cite to these NERC reports. NERC also collects a lot of data, including, for example, generator outages. NERC is responsible for collecting and putting together all of the data on how long generators around the United States failed to generate when they were supposed to, and when this occurred. This is called the Generating Availability Data System. Finally, NERC issues regulations for reliability. What must all bulk power system operators do to ensure the reliability of the grid? The bulk power system refers to the grid, specifically to generators and transmission lines and those who operate generation and transmission lines. They are subject to a variety of reliability standards, such as utilities must conduct vegetation management programs, also known as tree trimming around transmission lines. Utilities also must implement a variety of cybersecurity measures to prevent hacking. They must have certain software in their systems. There are many NERC reliability standards to which grid owners and operators are subject. Okay, let's talk about what's making this governance of grid reliability so difficult. And this comes from NERC. It comes from my own assessment and my co-author's assessment, as well as NERC itself. I noted that NERC publishes reliability assessments. Some of this data that I'm showing you here is from NERC's most recent reliability assessment for the upcoming This was for 2024, which has now passed, but this was for projecting what would happen in 2024. And I might have said FERC mistakenly. Sorry, this was NERC. Okay, NERC cites repeatedly to the challenge of extreme weather. We know that there are now more heat waves, which makes people turn on their air conditioning, and there are also below average winter temperatures at times. Overall, many of the winters are warmer, but we have these cold snaps that are now occurring and cause everyone to turn on their heat. So demand for electricity goes up during extreme weather. So you hear NERC. This is the text from the NERC saying, above average seasonal temperatures are contributing to high peak demand and forced outages, because temperature extremes can also cause power plants to stop operating properly. The power plants can freeze, as you know. Also, if it gets too hot, sometimes power plants do not work well. So temperature extremes cause increases in load, and they can also affect the operation of generators. Drought. It's now harder to predict when droughts will occur, and sometimes droughts are occurring for longer in different parts of the United States and Canada and Mexico. So I should have noted that Canada and Mexico are part of NERC assessments because our transmission lines are connected across international borders. So NERC has jurisdiction in Canada, and it anticipates that it will soon have jurisdiction in Mexico. So this is a map showing above average temperatures projected. The darker red shows the most extreme above average temperatures. And these, again, can contribute to drought. If you have drought, you have less hydroelectric power because there is not as much water flowing through the dam, and you don't have as much water available for coal-fired and natural gas-fired power plants or any plants that heat up water to produce steam to turn a turbine. Wildfires, as we know from recent events in Los Angeles, can also be a problem. Transmission lines for electricity can cause wildfires, and they have caused wildfires because they spark or they at least get hot. And if a tree limb touches a hot transmission wire, it can catch on fire. The wildfires themselves can then impact the infrastructure that's supposed to be carrying the electricity. In addition to extreme weather, intermittent generation is causing a problem. As I noted, wind and solar, the wind is not always blowing, sun's not always shining. Hydroelectricity, we don't always have water going through the turbines underneath the dams. Inverters that convert electricity from solar panels to the alternating current needed for the grid, they have been tripping too easily. There have been events in Texas, so that's been a problem. And this has caused NERC to say the pace of our grid transformation, what they're referring to is toward renewable energy, is a little out of sync with the system's technical requirements. What NERC has said is the system is not ready to accommodate lots and lots of renewables. I believe that Texas has shown otherwise. Texas has accommodated a large amount of wind and a growing amount of solar without major impacts on reliability. So what I argue in my paper with Josh Macy and Shelley Welton is that, in fact, our institutions need to improve. They need to catch up with the advancements that are occurring that are causing solar and wind energy to be built quickly. Nonetheless, regardless of who you think is at fault, intermittent generation does cause a challenge for reliability because it does not run all the time. Third problem, transmission. We do not have enough transmission in the United States to carry electricity generated to the load. This is a study, National Transmission Planning Study issued in 2024 by the US Department of Energy, showing what we might need. This is the sort of business as usual scenario on top. If you go down, you see many more transmission lines that would need to be built, both to accommodate all of the wind and solar. But even if we didn't build a lot more wind and solar energy, if we had more transmission lines connecting more parts of the United States, it would improve reliability. Another problem is, even for the transmission lines we already have, it is very hard for new generators to connect to the transmission lines. The worst case scenario is happening where I live in an area called PJM. So in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and into the Midwest, the entity that operates our transmission grid, it's a regional transmission organization called PJM. we have a massive backlog of generation resources. They are ready. They're ready to build. They're ready to provide the capacity, which is the physical generating infrastructure that we need to satisfy load in this region. But PJM is extremely slow in approving the requests for those generators to hook up to the grid. All right, so let me just quickly show why we are not getting enough transmission built in the United States and what the problems are with interconnection. So NERC has itself said that transmission is not being built fast enough. NERC cites to challenges associated with permitting and siting, which is the location of the transmission lines. I agree with NERC. It is very hard to get a new transmission line built because states which have authority over the location of the transmission lines are denying the transmission lines. And the companies have to get so many permits that it is causing substantial delays. So the lack of transmission is in part a regulatory problem. The system for approving transmission is not keeping up with the need for proposed new transmission projects. And so the National Transmission Planning Study is, again, this is from the US Department of Energy 2024. It is emphasizing we need to build a lot more transmission. And it's showing that this could substantially decrease the cost of our electricity system. Even though it's very expensive to build new transmission, the payoff would be huge to the tune of somewhere between 270 and 490 billion dollars. The problem is getting it built due to all of the hurdles. I noted the interconnection challenges in PJM, where I live. These are projects that were waiting in line. They were in a queue. They were proposed new generation wanting to hook up to the transmission lines operated and controlled by PJM. And look how many gigawatts of capacity were just waiting. These were generators that wanted to provide electricity to users. You can see that solar has is the biggest part of the line. There are lots and lots of solar farms that companies that want to build solar farms and hook up and can't. Batteries, storage are also waiting in line. Along with the solar plus battery, and the light green is wind. This is near 300 gigawatts waiting in line. And just for comparison, if you think of all of the wind already installed throughout the United States, that's 150 gigawatts. So if you think of all of the wind that's already operating in Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, other states, there are 150 gigawatts of wind turbines already operating. Compare this to the new capacity that could potentially be built, is waiting in line and can't get onto the grid in PJM. It's huge. Okay, there are lots of solutions. I won't talk too much about them here. We could have more federal involvement in the siting of transmission lines. One program that looks promising that has already been implemented is something called the Transmission Facilitation Program, where the Department of Energy serves as an anchor tenant for new transmission lines, which essentially means that the US Department of Energy promises that they will pay for 50% of the capacity in the new transmission line for a certain amount of time. But this isn't just solely a grant. There's a revolving loan component of it. So it's not just the Department of Energy handing out money. I think Texas competitive renewable energy zones are also a great example of how to get transmission built. This is where Texas, several decades ago now, I guess, or not quite that long, a while back, Texas, the government of Texas said, here's where the wind in Texas is. It's in West Texas. Texas required that utilities build transmission lines from the areas where there is wind to the load centers that will use the wind. And this is why Texas is now the leader in wind energy, among other reasons. I'll talk more about grid enhancing technologies if I have time. They essentially help move electrons through the existing transmission lines, and they reduce the need to build new transmission. Talk about those more soon. All right, resource adequacy. This is another challenge with grid reliability. There is not enough generation to meet demand. NERC has stated this in the form of maps. NERC is most worried about the Midwest Independent System Operator. This is the entity that controls the flow of electricity throughout much of the Midwest, including parts of Texas, not the ERCOT parts of Texas. This region is defined as high risk because even if there is not extreme weather in 2025, NERC thinks that there will not be enough generation capacity. There will not be enough physical generating plants to meet the demand of customers during peak demand periods when temperatures are hot, not even extremely hot, but just when temperatures are hot or cold. Elevated risk is the orange, meaning if there are extreme weather conditions, wildfires, et cetera, there might not be enough generation capacity to meet demand. And Texas, ERCOT, is in that orange. Now, as you know, the government of Texas is trying to fix that problem through the Proposition 7 construction of lots of new natural gas-fired power plants. But there is this concern of a supply shortfall. This map on the right shows specifically when there will be too little generation capacity to meet demand. And once again, MISO is the darkest, the scariest area, because starting in 2025, this is where there won't be enough generation resources. How do governments and the operators of the grid approach the need for more generation? One way is to run an auction. To say, we need X amount of new generation capacity, let's have an auction, and to require all utilities to bid into that auction. Another approach, like California, is to just say, we need a certain amount of resource adequacy, and then to allow the load-serving entity, which are electric utilities, they can decide how they meet the requirement. Texas has taken a top-down governmental approach through Proposition 7 on the ballot, constitutional amendment saying there will be approximately $10 billion allocated for the construction of new generation capacity. Capacity markets have had major problems recently. Where I live in PJM, there was an auction that resulted in $14.5 billion in commitments of new generation capacity. Those costs will be passed on to ratepayers. We will be paying for $14.5 billion of new generation, and our governor has sued our grid operator PJM because our governor is not happy about that. So it's hard to make sure we have enough capacity. The final issue I will focus on is flexibility. That is the need for resources on the electric grid that can very quickly respond to needs. You saw this in Texas if you were in Texas in 2021. At the worst point in Winter Storm Uri, approximately 49% of your generation capacity was not operating. You couldn't solve that problem by building 50% excess capacity. That is really expensive. There needed to be other approaches to addressing the problems that occurred during Uri. One was to just make sure that the capacity on the grid was actually operating. And Texas is, of course, working to solve those problems, making sure that pipelines will, in fact, get natural gas to the power plants, more carefully considering when plants should have planned outages. But as we build more solar and wind, and as we have more weather extremes, it's increasingly apparent that we need more of these flexible solutions, not just building more generation, but also responding in a very nimble and quick manner to a reduction in generation or an increase in load. And this can be on a seasonal basis. What if the wind does not blow as much in the Midwest as happened in 2023? It can also be daily. So in California, there's so much solar energy that people's demand for electricity from the grid, which is shown by these lines, goes way down. In fact, with this dark black line, which shows 2023, around 1 p.m. in California, people are demanding almost no electricity from the general grid because they're getting so much electricity from solar power. But guess what happens when the sun starts to go down? It starts to set around 6 p.m. Demand suddenly spikes. This is called the duck curve because it kind of looks like a duck. So demand for electricity from the grid goes way down, then it goes way up. And we need resources that can really quickly ramp, meaning they can very quickly infuse more electricity into the grid. And that means things like battery storage or demand response, getting people to reduce their demand so that the spike in demand doesn't go up as high. All right, so what are some of the solutions to all of these needs? The paper that I co-authored argues that we need NERC to do a better job. I want to emphasize that I think NERC is doing an incredible job given the challenges it faces, but I think it can do even better. And I'm not talking just about NERC, I'm talking about the sub-entities that NERC relies on to do much of its job. So NERC delegates much of its authority to these 6 different regional entities. One of them is the Texas Reliability Entity. They help develop the regulations for reliability. They also provide a lot of the data to NERC about what's going wrong with reliability, and they help with enforcement. And I think NERC and the regional entities need to do a lot more thinking about all of the issues I've just talked about, the need for flexible resources, thinking more about capacity and thinking of more creative ways to address capacity challenges. And I think part of that will mean infusing more public values into the NERC reliability standard development process. Right now, the reliability standards are primarily written by industry. There's this thing called the Standards Committee. They write the proposed standards, often in response to a proposal by a regional entity. And the Standards Committee consists of people who own the transmission grid, electric generators, utilities, which are load-serving entities. Then they send these standards to the Board of Trustees of NERC, and then FERC ultimately approves them. If you look at the members of the Standards Committee, we have Duke Energy, First Energy, Exelon Corporation, Eversource Energy, a lot of industry here. Now, there are some representatives of government if you scroll down, but not very many. So I'm going to skip forward a bit because we started late. I don't want to take too long. One proposal in our paper is let's include the public in NERC governance. Now, this is a very technical area, so we need industry involved. Industry knows how to run a reliable grid. But I think industry needs a little more prodding from the public about what the public wants with respect to reliability, how much the public is willing to pay for reliability. And I think we need more of those values infused in the decision-making process. Another challenge is there are just so many entities making decisions in this space. The state public utility commissions, the oil and gas agencies, regional transmission organizations. Do we need them to get together more? Do we need to coordinate them in one committee or task force? FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, is currently mandated to give a great deal of deference to all of the reliability standards proposed by NERC. We think that maybe that deference needs to be less strong, and that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is an agency that it reports to the president and Congress, they should probably oversee more what NERC is doing. And another question is whether NERC should even be folded into the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and serve as its technical advisor, because NERC has all of the technical details needed to ensure reliability. But as I've noted, I think they need to consider more all of these challenges that the system is currently facing that they have not yet fully addressed. So I'm going to stop there. I cut out some of my slides because we started late, but I do want to leave time for questions. And here is my email, as well as a link to the paper that discusses many of these issues, if anyone's interested. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah. So it was very impressive. So I will ask Professor Chinonso to take question and moderate the rest while I'm sharing the CLE credit with you in a minute.
Well, thank you very much, Karaman, and thank you, Professor Hannah, for that very insightful presentation. I want to go ahead and also roll out some of the questions that we have here, and I also encourage all the participants to share their questions in the slide if they have any. The first question I got here, it says, what can the rest of Texas learn from El Paso, Texas, who is tapped into the Western Interconnection Southwest? Is some of Texas tapping into the other grids a possibility? That's the first question. I think we'll take that, then I can read the other questions.
Thanks. A great question. I think Texas can learn a lot from El Paso. I think that more interconnection of Texas with other parts of the grid would be beneficial. This is shown in the FERC and NERC assessment of what happened during Winter Storm Uri. So the primary cause of the reliability problems in Winter Storm Uri was the lack of weatherization, the fact that the power plants themselves froze. That was the primary cause. But there were many other important causes, such as the fuel didn't go to the power plants, and the fact that Texas could not import that much electricity from other regions that were not as cold. And what FERC and NERC said in the report is if you look at the Southwest Power Pool and MISO, which were other grid operators close to Texas that were also experiencing cold weather, they did not suffer as much as Texas because they were able to have more energy exchanges, meaning they were able to get more electricity from other regions. And this is where expanding the grid, building more transmission among regions, including into Texas, would be beneficial.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. Another question here is, can nuclear energy be an option for the future?
Yes, I know nuclear has gone through a variety of phases. I think there was a lot of concern about nuclear following Chernobyl, the incident in what was then the Soviet Union, as well as 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. But I think there's, to some degree, a nuclear renaissance right now, in part because we have so much need for more generation and quick generation for all of these large loads. They're looking to nuclear. Nuclear is a base load source of power. It runs all of the time. In fact, it's quite inefficient to shut down a nuclear power plant. And nuclear is zero carbon. It does not emit any of the carbon dioxide that's contributing to climate change, and which is in turn partly contributing to all these these weather extremes. So personally, I think nuclear is an important part of the generation mix, especially if we're talking about that firm base load capacity that we need to make sure we're meeting all load. I understand that people are still concerned about the risks associated with the disposal of the waste in particular, because we have no centralized waste repository. So all of the waste is sitting at the nuclear power plants themselves. We need to fix that challenge. But overall, I think nuclear is quite important.
Okay. I have one here. I'm trying to read that. Question says, I'm very interested in your proposal to have the public more involved in telling NERC what they want in terms of reliability versus cost. What do you think that would look like in practice? A comment period versus a town hall, or versus some sort of a vote of some sort, or all of the above? And also,
yeah, okay, sorry, I interrupted.
Secondly, also interested in your thoughts on whether the public would understand the nuances of what they were commenting on. Any chance it would be counterproductive due to confusion?
Excellent questions. I'll take the second aspect of this first. I think we need to be very careful. Those of us like me and like Shelley Welton and Josh Macy who proposed more public involvement, we need to be careful in recognizing that the public role is necessarily limited because this is such a technical area. If you read a NERC reliability standard, your eyes will immediately glaze over and you will wish you were an electrical engineer. I mean, the terms are just astoundingly complicated. However, I do think that we need a limited role for the public, because one criticism of NERC from other regulators, including FERC, is that they are too technical. They are not results oriented. So following the 2003 blackout that hit New York City, Toronto, and other parts of the Northeast and caused billions of dollars in damage, the commission, the governments that investigated the cause specifically said NERC You are not results oriented. And I think that's where the public can be useful. Even without all of the technical knowledge necessary to write the actual reliability standard, I think the public can put more productive pressure on NERC to face the modern challenges. I also think that the public can help NERC get out of what I view as maybe path dependence. NERC, a lot of the experts at NERC have done incredible work for many, many years. They started with a very different grid. And I think the public is saying, we want more reliability, we want to incorporate solar and wind, but still have reliability. They can put pressure on to sort of nudge the experts into the modern system and just make it clear that this is what people are wanting and worried about. How would the procedures look? Would it be a town hall? Would it be notice and comment? Shelley Welton at Penn has written a lot more about this than I have, but briefly, I think it would be helpful to have the public actually as a voting member on the standards committee in NERC. This already happens in some regional transmission organizations. Now the members of the public are carefully selected. Often they have to have some expertise in energy, but they are voting entities. This is only in some of the RTOs. So I think this can be done. I think a second best solution would be something like moving NERC more toward a notice and comment rulemaking model in which before they issued a reliability standard, they needed to accept comments and consider comments from the public. I do worry though about slowing down the standards because one of the problems is that NERC is not acting quickly enough. It took NERC a really long time to require weatherization of generating infrastructure. So that's the balance that needs to be reached. And so we need to think really carefully about incorporating public input without slowing the decision-making process down too much.
Okay. I have two more questions here, maybe three, and then I think we'll wrap up at two. The first one, it's how do you factor in the EV demand and new data center demand and crypto mining on the grid? And let me also read the other questions so you can take them all together. And the next one is, if the choke point is transmission, what's being done to increase transmission? And if I could quickly add one here myself, I'm thinking, when you're thinking about NERC, does NERC have the capacity to address most of the challenges that we have? Some of them might even be outside the scope of NERC since they are all modern and relating to extreme weather conditions. So to what extent is NERC limited in that aspect? And what might be, if we could reduce the regulatory autonomy of NERC in this instance, might that not lead to some form of regulatory capture by short-term political interest and then undermine the long-term grid plan? And I know that's a lot, but as much as you can get to within 2 minutes.
Sure, 2 minutes. Thanks. So with respect to incorporating EV demand, I will very quickly share my screen. Hopefully I'm not sharing a picture of my children. So this should be this is the NERC long-term reliability assessment. So what regional transmission organizations do, as well as these regional entities that are subunits of NERC, they have experts projecting demand based on reporting from utilities, because utilities are getting all of these requests from the AI, et cetera. But these are just projections, right? We can't know. And this is what a lot of grid operators are struggling with right now, is how accurate are Amazon's or Google's or other large data center companies' projections about how much they're really going to build. So the answer is, we can't know exactly. Same with electrification. You can look at state policies, you can look at consumer adoption of cars, but the modelers just have to make their best guess as to whether those adoption rates will continue to expand. Now, transmission, what's being done to increase transmission? I mentioned the DOE's transmission facilitation program, where the Department of Energy is promising that they will be a client for a new transmission line, which is really important because people won't build transmission if they don't know that someone is actually going to use it. That's how Texas solved the problem, by designating competitive renewable energy zones that ran to the windy parts of Texas and requiring companies to build the transmission. They solved that problem. So that transmission facilitation program is promising. There are also these things called national interest electric transmission corridors that the Department of Energy can designate and can override state siting constraints. So when states say you can't put a transmission line here, in limited instances, the federal government can disagree. Finally, yes, many of the challenges noted here are beyond the authority of NERC, especially transmission. NERC has no authority to mandate the construction of a new transmission line or the siting of that transmission line. So we can't blame NERC for many of these challenges. We need to think about the many different regulatory entities and private and public involved here and get them together, I think, and better coordinate planning. And yes, I believe that reducing NERC's capacity and just giving more power to FERC or another governmental entity could result in more problems rather than fewer. Regulatory capture is when you have the big industry interests that have repeat interactions with regulators being able to have an outsized voice in the process. So that would definitely be a concern no matter how we changed up the amount of authority NERC had, and we would need to think about how to reduce those forces of potential capture. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for attending. Professor Hannah, someone asked if the slides would be available, so if you can make the slides available to us,
I will send them to you.
Website. Thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll get to see all of you again next month at our next session. Thank you, Karaman, and thank you, Professor Wiseman.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Take
much.
care all.
Thank you so much.